It is my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. For more than 30 years, she has worked as a journalist for Radio-Canada, CBC, La Presse, Le Devoir, and CTV. In 1980, she co-founded the feminist magazine La Vie en Rose. She is a prolific film director whose credits include Monsieur, a documentary on former Quebec Premier Jacques Parizeau. She is also Concordia's 2014 Michener-Deacon Fellow for Journalism Education. So please welcome Francine Pelletier.
Merci. Merci, Brian. This talk is about understanding what's changed for women and, more importantly, what hasn't and why it hasn't. We celebrated on December 6th of last year an important anniversary. It's been 25 years since 14 women were shot and killed at École Polytechnique here in Montreal. This date constitutes a milestone for women, for feminism, for the history of this province and this country. Nothing this horrible had ever happened here before, and never before in the long history of mass killings had women been singled out. And I stress, singled out. The killer, Marc Lépine, went to a classroom, separated the men from the women, ordered the teacher and the male students to leave, and then proceeded to shoot all 9 women remaining in the class, 6 of which died. His rampage also included gunning women down as he went through the cafeteria, down corridors, and another classroom, and always he made sure, and this is the particularly chilling aspect of this tragedy, to kill only women, going so far as to tell men to get out of the way. I'm describing this not only because you may or may not be aware of the details of what happened in 1989 in a university not unlike this one, but because the essence of what happened that night, the fact that women were being murdered because they were women, was ignored and obscured in the wake of the tragedy. I should mention that there was a difference between the treatment in French media and the treatment in English media. The closer you were to the event, the greater the denial. But denial there was. For example, 2 days after the killings, the Globe and Mail had an editorial titled, "Why Were Women in the Gun Sight?" essentially bemoaning the fact that women are still victims of discrimination, while Le Soleil, the Quebec City newspaper, on the same day went so far as to write that the tragedy had, and I quote, "nothing to do with women." If someone had entered a classroom, separated white students from black students, and proceeded to kill the black students, all the headlines the next day would have read, in bold letters, "racist attack." There was not one headline, not even in the Globe and Mail, saying "sexist attack" or "anti-feminist kills 14 women." And this despite the fact that Lépine left a suicide note explaining his motives, spelling out the fact that he hated feminists, they had always ruined his life, he said, and that he decided to send them ad patres, to their ancestors, as a political statement. Lépine could be called our first terrorist, but he wasn't called a terrorist. Nor was this called an assault on women or on equal rights. Lépine was seen, as he himself foresaw in his letter, as a crazed gunman, period. Here in Quebec, especially in French-speaking Quebec, we desperately needed to think this had nothing to do with us. The world over, the killings inspired testimonials, seminars, books, songs, movies, TV shows. Israel planted 14 trees in tribute to the victims in the months following. Here it took 10 years for the city of Montreal to build a commemorative space to the 14 women, 20 years before there was any kind of important intellectual endeavor on the subject. I'm thinking of Denis Villeneuve's film. And 25 years before there was a collective reckoning, before we all agreed, from the police chief down, that this indeed had been a crime against women. It was a long time coming, but when it did last December, it was only fitting that the sky lit up with beams of light. The fact that it took such a long time to admit the obvious is a sign, I think, that despite visible progress, the last 25 years have not been that kind to women. After Polytechnique, the feminist revolution, not only here in Quebec but elsewhere, definitely stalled. In her book, Backlash, The Ongoing War Against American Women, Susan Faludi chronicled how, starting in the mid-'80s, the media is dropping all kinds of hints about the dangers of feminism. You might remember this one. A woman over 40 has a better chance of being killed by a terrorist than of getting married. In other words, the more you neglect finding Mr. Right, the more you are going to be left behind. There's also talk of professional women being increasingly infertile and having more mental illnesses than their non-working counterparts. As of the early 90s, feminism has become a bit of an F word. While the advancement of women goes unquestioned, the idea that there's much more to accomplish is decidedly unpopular. The overarching sentiment is that women's advancement will take care of itself. And of course, the number of women in university is a decisive factor in making us believe that all we have to do is sit back and wait. Women are increasingly the majority in the classrooms and often the top students. It's just a question of time before they have all the top jobs, right? Wrong. Women are not making it to the top in the way that their academic success seems to indicate they should. And we have had enough time now to really know that this is a scientific fact. So what's happening? Why is there a big gap between the success of women in the classroom and their much more limited success in the workplace? Why are women still making considerably less money, including Hollywood actresses, than men? Sheryl Sandberg, one of the few women to make it to the top rungs of the digital empire, she's chief operating officer at Facebook, has written about this in a book called Lean In. You probably have heard about that as well. And she says that on top of external barriers holding women back, women are hindered by barriers that exist within ourselves, she writes. We hold ourselves back in ways both big and small, by lacking self-confidence, by not raising our hands, and by pulling back when we should be leaning in. I too have found in my own work that there is a gap between how far women have come, their place today in the world, how they present themselves, and how they feel about themselves. I call it the inner jello. There is a hesitancy and self-doubt, and I include myself in this, that is hanging on despite 4 decades of feminism. Why is this? Is it just that it takes a really long time before what you think and what you feel are on the same wavelength? Or is there something else holding women back? I think there is. Over the last 25 years, there have been 2 major obstacles, in my view, to women's ongoing emancipation. Those things are violence, the real war, ongoing war against women, and what is known today as hypersexualization. We can thank Jian Ghomeshi for blowing the lid off the most pervasive and insidious form of violence, sexual abuse. You probably know many of the details already, but for those who don't, Ghomeshi was a hugely popular radio host on CBC who was fired last fall after it was discovered that he'd had troubling sexual relations with a number of young women. Ghomeshi argued that his preference for rough sex was his right and that it had always been consensual. It was nobody's business what he liked to do in the bedroom. He seemed to have made a point until a number of women came forward to say it wasn't, in fact, consensual. With those confessions, we got a bird's eye view of something we all knew existed, but without it ever resonating in the same way before. I remember in the wake of the Montreal massacre, women saying, now they will believe us. Now they will realize what women are up against. But of course, that's not at all what happened. And it's not just because of the denial I was describing, but because women themselves were not that tempted to equate their own experience with the brutal slaying of women on a university campus. It was just too extreme. But that moment they were hoping for, the moment when you connect the dots, was happening now. The Ghomeshi affair was definitely something women could identify with. We've always liked to think that violence against women was about big bad boogeymen lurking in the shadows at night. In 1975, the American journalist Susan Brown Miller published a very important book that proved for the first time the opposite. She showed that rape was not really about sex, but about power, and not the deed of bad men, but ordinary men, sometimes even exceptional men. Think of Bill Cosby or Dominique Strauss-Kahn, the former head of the International Monetary Union. Both are now facing accusations of sexual abuse. The Ghomeshi affair might just prove a turning point in terms of violence against women because it showed, better still than Brown Miller's book, the unexceptionalness of it all. It showed how much of the violence women experience is in a gray zone, a place no one dragged you by the hair to, a place that as a woman you came willingly to, even perhaps eagerly to, but where something suddenly goes wrong. From smooching to smacking, as Lucy says, with no buildup. It's hugely important also because the response to the Ghomeshi affair triggered a response from women all over the world, thanks to women like Sue Montgomery, formerly of the Montreal Gazette, who's going to be joining me on stage for the question period, and Antonia Zerbisius, formerly of the Toronto Star, who together created the hashtag Been Raped, Never Reported. Women were able to stand up and be counted with their own mini confessions of sexual abuse. Within 48 hours, there were over 8 million hits of Been Raped, Never Reported. A sister hashtag was created here in Quebec, Agression non dénoncée, which prompted a similar response as well as testimonials by well-known women, including the head of Le Conseil du Statut de la Femme, who is here tonight, Julie Miville-Deschênes. Women have made great strides since my generation took to the streets 4 decades ago. Laws were changed, discrimination was banned, women became a vital part of the job market, of the economy, and of course of the education system. And yet violence against women continues as if none of this had ever happened. I think violence against women is the Western world's dirty little secret. By secret, I mean shoved to the margins and not taken seriously. Why? Because it puts into question the great promise that most of us hold dear, that men and women are meant to find each other, love, and better each other. And it's a great dream. It's also a means of constant intimidation towards women, a way of keeping them down. But women will never be fully equal as long as the threat of sexual and domestic violence persists. I also think that the lack of self-confidence, what I call the inner jello, is in part fed by the threat of impending danger, which every woman knows, no matter what her age or her status. Maybe 100 years from now, when both men and women are given exactly the same upbringing, opportunities, education, maybe we'll see that then that there will always be a greater reluctance amongst women. Maybe there is a biological factor to holding back. But right now, I think much more is feeding into women's hesitancies. Part of it is fear, and that fear is coming from the outside. There is something else adding to the inner jello, something else holding women back. This is not an insidious phenomenon like sexual or domestic violence. This is very much in our faces and media-driven. Hypersexualization, the fact that we are inundated today with images of super sexy women wherever you turn. Like perhaps many women, it took me a while to seize upon the perils of hypersexualization, not only because every woman wants to be sexy, but because feminism, I think, had a hand in this. Second wave feminism was about reclaiming our bodies for ourselves and making our own choices. It meant asserting ourselves in every way you could, including sexually. Hypersexualization is the advertising and fashion industry's response to women's liberation. That at a time when women are challenging social, political, and corporate norms, we are being inundated by women who are precisely not threatening. A woman in a bikini is not very threatening. Women, in other words, who are not taking up a lot of room and making stringent demands. Don't assume for a moment that this is a coincidence. A recent study conducted by Princeton and Stanford universities in the US confirms the idea that there is a price to pay for the overt sexualization of women. The study shows that if you subject people, men or women, to images of women with very little clothes on, the brain does not register them as being fully human. The more naked the person, the least we perceive that person as having emotions, intelligence, ethics, you name it. So all these sexy images of women everywhere are not innocuous. I've often thought that the overall media message to women is, you want to be like men? At least make sure you don't look like one. It's a negotiating tactic, albeit an unconscious one, to keep things under control. Just like violence, it's a way to keep women in their places, not to send us back in droves to the kitchen, of course, but it's a way of taking a certain credibility away from women, if we like it or not. I think it's important to attract attention to this at a time when we like to think of ourselves, we of the free world, as terribly ahead of the game in terms of women. To the images of burqa-clad, fully hidden women, unable to go to school or make their own choices, we like to oppose the images of barely clad, fancy-free women. It's tit for tat, if you'll pardon the expression. These are the two major cultural images of our time. It's easy to think that the Western image of women is a tribute to our emancipation, but there's a trap here. 10 years ago, I did a 6-hour series on women and sex precisely because of the images I've been describing. The contrast between the women in burqas, and we were seeing women in burqas for the first time, it was the Afghan war, and the women here on billboards was so stark that I felt the need to investigate. The message is total repression on one hand and total freedom on the other. I wanted to ask women here if they felt as free sexually as the images imply. I interviewed over 100 women, and overall the feeling is yes, women have come a long, long way in terms of how they experience their sexuality. But a number of women, quite a few of them, felt that they were being pressured, that women today are expected to be these high-performance sexual animals. And some, without necessarily feeling pressured, thought this was great, that this was just all part of being an emancipated woman today, exactly what the billboards seem to be saying. Then I asked a small group of men what they thought of highly sexual women to see if they too saw this as the evolving status of women. They didn't. And these were not old fogies. A woman who flaunted her sexuality was a little cheap in their eyes. The judgment was not as harsh as in the good old days, but there was a gap between what some women saw as their girl power and what these men saw as unbefitting. Another clue that A, there's still very much a double standard for women, and B, women are not at all as free as we like to think. So where does this leave us? At the beginning of this talk, I promised some good news, and I realize it's been pretty bad so far. I've gone to some lengths to explore the skeletons in the closet because over the last 25 years, I think the last 25 years have been marked by a certain complacency, a tendency to say, look how far we've come, which tends to obscure the ongoing problems. The good news is Patricia Arquette saying what she did on Oscar night, Emma Watson going to the United Nations, and a young woman making sure people know what it's like to walk in her shoes. It's acknowledging that we're not there yet, much more has to be done, and hell yes, we're ready to go the extra mile. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Francine. Thank you for that very thoughtful and challenging talk tonight. For 30 years, Sue Montgomery was a reporter who worked around the globe, and especially here in Montreal. And she worked in the Justice Department for the paper. And she, as been mentioned, she co-created the hashtag Ben Rape Never Reported, which sparked a global, and I heard some of the applause here, conversation about gender-based violence with over 10,000. It seems like it's more than that. 10 million, that's right, 10 million. So with that, please welcome Sue Montgomery.
Yeah, so it's great to see men in the audience, and because a lot of times, not that all men are bad, of course, but sometimes we feel like we're preaching to the converted. So we want you to go out and spread the word. I'm really honored to be with Francine tonight because she was my idol during my career, which is now, well, it's not over. It's just on hold. I've left the Gazette a month ago, and I'm really happy. And but I will be passing the hat later. Okay, so I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and I really hope that you will fill out the forms and send us some questions that I can pose. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was the fact that we don't have sex education anymore in school. I think Quebec axed it in 2005 or something. So my son came home the other day from school. Well, I shouldn't say my son. A boy that I know came home from school one day and said, oh, we had the sex ed talk again. So apparently if we have sex, we're either going to get pregnant or we'll die. So I said, that's a good start. So, but they seem like all kids have the smartphones and access to porn. So my fear is what they're seeing on pornography is not realistic, and they're not learning how to have a respectful, healthy sexual relationship, or even just a relationship. So do you want to talk a bit about that?
Actually, I had a piece there on pornography, but I had to cut it out. Pornography is very much part of the problem. We don't see it. It's not in our face like the billboards, but it's there, and it's true that I think a whole generation, not just of boys, of girls, are growing up with pornography, and the mantra is, I am a bitch, I am a slut, I am a whore, hit me hard. Women are pleading to be hurt and abused on these sites, and it's quite natural for a young person to look at that and think that's what sex is about. There was a great quote from my mentor, Chris Hedges, the great American journalist, who he writes, and if you don't know this site, please put it on your list, Truth Dig. He talked about pornography as that's what the end of the world is going to look like, and he had a big jab to the left, saying, here we are on the left bemoaning poor Asian women in sweatshops and the torture of Iraqi prisoners as if they were on a porn site. But what we're subjecting women on real porn sites, that in the name of freedom of expression, that's all fine, So that's a big dark spot, a big blind spot, which I don't think we've addressed to any length. And having no sexual education in the school doesn't help.
So you can comment a bit on, in Ontario, the Premier, Kathleen Wynne, has introduced quite a controversial sex education curriculum. So maybe you can talk a bit about that. Like, is that what we need?
Well, I do not have a young child in school, so I'm not sure what the sexual education in schools in Quebec are like right now. I trust that it's not much. I would absolutely think that that's what we need, and I don't understand why it's been cut. So yes, we could. That's one way of doing. But I think we also have to just not pretend that pornography isn't there.
I'm interested in the fact that after Polytechnique 25 years ago, women, we were in denial. Like, people didn't want to use the F word. All of a sudden, feminism became this bad word. And now, what do you think has changed in the 25 years? Why all of a sudden has there been this sea change? Like, it just seems everywhere you look now, people are talking about this. has the lid been kept on it, and we're just
I
set up, or is it the next generation?
I think two things happened. First, the generation that followed mine, like most generations, was not too happy or too keen on doing exactly what the former generation had just done, right? So we were, like, we were, that was over, that was then, this is now, and of course when you're young, the first thing you want to believe is life is going to be fine, and, and there has been some fantastic changes for women. So I think they were focusing on that, and the times were crappy for any kind of social movement. The 90s were a terrible time, where everyone went to the gym, and that's all,
And bought real estate. Don't forget the condos.
It was. I sometimes wonder, like, between the 70s and in the 80s, there was actually 20 years there, but they were actually, something happened, Reagan, Thatcher, recession, we can all name it, but the times changed very quickly during the 80s, and by the 90s, individualism was in, and that we didn't want to hear about, like changing the world and stuff. Everyone was changing their bodies, sort of thing. And so now we have a new generation of women. So already they're not so, I'm not going to be like my mother, sort of thing. And they've realized that things haven't changed that much. And of course, things like when Beyonce goes on stage, God bless her, and puts feminism big like this, it helps. It really helps. I think every little bit helps. And Emma Watson going to the United States, Emma Watson going to the United Nations. I think young women are understanding that things have not profoundly changed. I mean, we've changed laws, but some things haven't changed. Attitudes in some cases haven't changed. And of course, the harassment hasn't changed, and the salaries are not up to par, and there are many things to change. So I think they're getting angry, that had disappeared. And I think the Gomeshti was, in a way, a godsend, because I think it illuminated something that had never been seen so clearly before, and how widespread and how easy and how pervasive it is, and how banal it is. The banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt would say. It was all there in that story.
What about in terms of how the media covers sexual assault now? Do you think that they've gotten better at it, or is it still sort of victim blaming?
Well, I should ask you the question, because what you've done is fantastic.
Yeah, but that wasn't covering anything.
No, but the media, that
was just being mad and impulsive.
I feel like asking you, don't you think that the media paid, like, not only was there suddenly this wave of denunciation, which I hadn't seen in 30 years, but more important, or as important, I hadn't heard that kind of attention to what was happening.
Yeah.
All people, society, men, women, everyone was paying attention. Do you not think that happened around there?
Yeah, but I think that it was social media. I think that what happened is, we threw out that tweet within, like, we didn't really, it's not like we planned it, and
the best things are unplanned.
It was totally knee-jerk on Facebook discussion. I've never met Antonia, by the way. I've never met her in person. We've always conspired together on social media. And what I wanted to do was just create a list. Like, what would a list look like if we compiled all the names of the women who had been raped and never reported it? Like, I thought that list would stretch around the world, which in fact it did. So, to me, I think it was social media as a tool that women took over, and the trolls shut up. I think the trolls were very frightened by that. But that brings me to my next point. Like, how do we get men involved? Because, it's easy enough to convince women to get on board because they often are the targets of this sexual violence. But men are as well. But men often can feel threatened by the F word. So what can we do to change attitudes of men?
Am I a man?
You're not a man? Okay. Pretend you're a man.
Well, I think the first thing is, it's true that it will always feel like it's more of a women's issue. There's always a stretch there, you know. I remember, in fact, a great column by your former colleague. What's the political columnist at the Gazette? Yes, he wrote a great column after the Montreal massacre, saying that he suddenly understood what fear meant for women. You know, like what it meant to be going down the street and suddenly, you know, like not being totally at ease. So I don't know how that becomes a widespread thing. I think, first of all, women have to demystify feminism, that it's not this big bad thing, that it's not about hating men, and it's about understanding how the world works and why women have to, you know, are still disadvantaged in so many ways. Mm-hmm. And I think how you make that a man's problem, I'm at a loss to say that. I think the men who love women will get it, you know? So maybe love is the answer.
Aww, that's so sweet. Okay, does anybody else have questions? You know, I've run out of questions. I'm not, no, I was going to say I'm not getting paid to ask questions, but okay. Ooh, that's a good one. What would you change, if anything, if Hillary Clinton would become president of the United States? What would change? Sorry. You're right.
One of the things is that we are now in 2015. We're not back in the 70s. And so you can't pretend things have not changed and at all. And the fact of, I think the idea of having a woman as the first woman president of the United States is fantastic. It's a historical moment. I try in my hearts of hearts to like Hillary, and I can't. I just can't. You know, I mean, there's also, we can say now, I think we're far enough to say it's not because you're a woman that right. we all, you know, it's not that easy.
Well, look at Margaret Thatcher.
Exactly. And I think Hillary has major problems. And at the same time, she's earned it. God knows she's fought for it. But I think the last caper, for me, she's lost, again, a lot of points. So what would change for women? Is that the question? I'm not sure. She sees herself as a great advocate for women, so who am I? You know, like I think she would be a sense. She would have an ear out for it for sure. At the same time, the way she has led her what we've seen of her as in public policy, apart from women, is not all that feminist. You know, mm-hmm. So I'm quite ambivalent.
Some women consider themselves not affected by the situation of women in our society. That's true. How would you convince them that they are touched by gender inequality as well?
I think that's one of the great things that happened like 40 years ago. I think that we broke through that. No, I don't identify with women. You know, I don't have those problems. I think that was the movement was big enough and strong enough and crazy enough to and the times were right for that, so that most women recognized themselves. So I think that today, that kind of attitude is kind of, I think it's few and far between, personally. Mm-hmm. And all I can say is, well, like the generation of women today, they will figure, at some point, it's going to catch up with them.
Yeah. So this is an interesting question, talking about the coverage of rape in the media. So there was this story in the Rolling Stone magazine, December 2014, a rape on campus, and it was proven false a few months after, and after the male students were demonized and assaulted. Is that what it says? Yes. Like the 5 men in the Duke University lacrosse story. So the question is, why should we automatically believe a rape story?
Well, I think the whole, I mean, I don't think you automatically believe anything, but I sort of don't understand, like, the question, I guess, the underlying thought here seems to be that women have an interest in lying about rape. I don't think so. I really don't think so. And I think that's what the 8 million hits proved, that most women have probably some not too comfortable experience that they've gone through that they don't know what to do with. And it's not rape, but it's something that they deal with or have dealt with. And I think that's what has to come out. I think there are cases of unfounded rape, but I think they're few and far between. One of the great things about the Ghomeshi affair, for the first time, you had the police, the Toronto police, pleading women to come forward, saying, we're going to treat your stories seriously. You're going to be respected. You will be received. You will be heard. And that's part of the reason why we're in the situation in the first place, because it's not people, you don't want to go to the police. You don't think you'll be heard. So I think that's the work that needs to be done, sort of thing.
You mentioned Beyonce and her feminist message. Do you not think that there is a contradiction between the message of women's rights and the requirement of women performers to be sexualized?
Yeah, no, you could say, she's just sort of, she's demeaning feminism by, like being this super sexual icon sort of thing. But I think that someone high profile like Beyonce saying that feminism is something that she values, which means standing up, believing in women, standing up for women, fighting for women, is important. After that, we could, I haven't rarely seen Beyonce, so I can't really qualify her performances. But I don't think we should be too purist. I don't think we can afford to be too purist at this point, I think we need all the help we can get.
Arquette's outburst actually at the, what was that award? Oscars, thank you. Don't watch TV. Actually created a backlash amongst women of color in the U.S. and Canada who felt that since she did not mention racism, it was just, again, white women for white women. What do you think about that?
I think I don't have a lot of patience with that. I just think here's a woman who has the guts to say on an important night when you're nervous and you don't have much time, she says she's sending a political message, and someone saying you didn't say the political message quite right, I think is like, it's trying to make yourself interesting.
Can you talk about the role of internet movements like Red Pill? Okay, I don't know what happened.
No, I can't.
Gamergate. Yeah, what's the internet? And spreading the interweb, as my mom calls it. But I mean online, like social media, in terms of hatred against women and spreading that, and the fact that people can do this anonymously.
Well, this is why, again, I think what you did and what's happening with the response around Ghomeshi and sexual abuse is so wonderful, because we know that one of the great traps of social media is how much hatred is out there, and misogyny and all kinds of racism, and it just spews out. It's discouraging, really. And for once, to have that, to have them stop and to have another kind of voice come through is fantastic. So, and in fact, if it wasn't during the horrible 90s, feminism was partly kept alive by young feminists on internet blogging. So I think there's a great future there.
How do you think young female journalists are to overcome the challenges of making it in a male-dominated industry and strive? I just want to make a comment here. I don't think it is male-dominated anymore because the industry is dying and the pay is shit. So the men aren't going to do it. So now, women, come and run our newspaper that's sinking.
Exactly.
Thank you, man. That goes off and gets a well-paying job.
Yeah. Well,
So how do you overcome the inner jello? I like that.
The inner jello.
I have outer jello too, actually. I call the jello. What's going on?
I don't know. You have to give yourself permission. You have to say you're not going to sabotage yourself. You have to believe in yourself. It's a long time. It takes. It doesn't overcome that easy. You have to work at it.
And confidence. It's confidence.
Yeah, it's treating yourself well, I think, and thinking you're worth it.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Believing in yourself.
Yeah. Believing.
So easy. Just believe in yourself.
I would like to thank Sue for moderating tonight, and of course to Francine for this very challenging talk. And I think that there's definitely some things we need to take with us from this talk tonight, and that we need to think about, and that we need to keep thinking about, and challenging ourselves to make sure that there is true equality for all of us. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you very much.